There is a silence that isn't peaceful. It's not the quiet of a library or the hush of a forest at dawn. It's a loud silence, a screaming silence. It's the kind of quiet that presses in on you, that seeps into your pores and replaces the marrow in your bones with cold, buzzing dread. Imagine you are in a room. There are no windows. The walls are white. The floor is white. The ceiling is white. The single light fixture above you, which is never turned off, bathes everything in a flat, shadowless, sterile glow. Your clothes are white. The food they slide through a slot in the door is white unseasoned rice, a piece of white bread. The guards who watch you through a peephole wear white. Their footsteps are muffled by the thick, sound-absorbent padding on the walls and floor outside your cell. You hear nothing. No birds. No traffic. No distant voices. For days, then weeks, then months, the only sounds are the ones you make. Your own breathing, the frantic thumping of your own heart, and eventually the sound of your own voice whispering, then talking, then shouting just to prove to yourself that you still exist. This is not a scene from a science fiction film. This is a technique, a weapon. It's known as the White Room, a form of sensory deprivation and isolation designed for one purpose: to completely unmake a person, to erase their identity, break their will, and dismantle their psyche piece by piece, without ever laying a hand on them. This is the new face of horror, the perfected art of a dark science that came of age in the 20th century. This is the world of psychological torture. For most of human history, torture was a brutally physical affair. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the branding iron, these were tools of the body. Their aim was to inflict such unbearable physical pain that the victim would confess, recant, or simply break. The scars were visible, the evidence undeniable. But the 20th century, an age of unprecedented technological advancement and ideological conflict, gave birth to a new kind of cruelty. It was a subtler, more insidious form of torment, one that left no visible marks but carved canyons of trauma deep within the mind. The great conflicts of this era, from the trenches of World War I to the jungles of Vietnam and the covert battlegrounds of the Cold War, became proving grounds for a terrifying new arsenal. This was the dawn of industrialized mental warfare, where the human mind itself became the primary target. Today, we're going to journey into that silent, terrifying battlefield. We will explore the evolution of psychological torture throughout the modern wars of the 20th century, examining the methods, the masterminds, and the devastating human cost. This isn't just a story about pain. It's a story about the weaponization of psychology, the systematic effort to understand the breaking points of the human spirit in order to exploit them for political and military gain. From the shell-shocked soldiers of the Somme to the CIA's mind control experiments and the ghost-haunted jungles of Southeast Asia, we will uncover how the architects of conflict learned that the most effective prison isn't made of steel and concrete, but of fear, confusion, and despair, constructed inside the captive's own skull. This is the history of a war fought in the quietest rooms and the loudest silences, a war whose casualties are still walking among us. The story of 20th century psychological torture doesn't begin in a sterile interrogation cell. It begins in the mud and chaos of the Western Front. World War I was a conflict unlike any before it. It was a war of machines. Machine guns that cut down men in waves, artillery that could obliterate entire landscapes and turn night into a hellish, strobing day. For the soldiers huddled in the trenches, it was an experience of prolonged, unimaginable stress. The constant threat of death, the deafening noise of shelling that never seemed to stop, the sight of comrades being torn apart, it was an assault on the senses and the soul that the human mind was simply not equipped to handle. Soon, a strange new ailment began to appear. Soldiers, even those without a single physical wound, would begin to tremble uncontrollably. They would lose the ability to speak, to walk, or to see. They would stare blankly into space, haunted by visions, or become paralyzed with a terror that had no immediate cause. The military doctors of the time were baffled. They called it shell shock. The name itself implies a physical cause, the shockwave of an exploding shell rattling the brain. But it was far more complex. It was the mind's desperate attempt to escape an unbearable reality. It was the first time in modern history that the psychological toll of warfare was witnessed on a mass industrial scale. The initial response from military command was one of contempt and suspicion. These men were often labeled cowards, malingerers, or weaklings. They were accused of faking their symptoms to escape the front lines. The treatments were often as brutal as the conditions that caused the illness. Sufferers were subjected to disciplinary punishments, public shaming, and painful electric shock therapies, designed to jolt them back to their senses. In some cases, soldiers suffering from severe shell shock were court-martialed and even executed for desertion. But a few pioneering doctors, like Charles Myers in Britain, began to see shell shock not as a failure of character, but as a legitimate psychological injuria wound of the mind. They recognized that the constant fear, the helplessness, and the sensory overload of trench warfare could shatter a person's nervous system. This was a crucial turning point. For the first time, the military-industrial complex was forced to acknowledge the mind's fragility. They began, reluctantly at first, to study it. They were learning, through the tragic suffering of millions, just how vulnerable the human psyche was. And as with any new discovery in a time of conflict, the question soon shifted from, how do we heal it? To, how do we use it? The lessons of shell shock were not lost on the emerging totalitarian regimes of the interwar period. If the stress of the battlefield could break a trained soldier, what could controlled, concentrated stress do to a political dissident in a quiet room? The Gestapo in Nazi Germany and the NKVD in the Soviet Union became the first true laboratories for this dark art. They moved beyond simple beatings and physical abuse, which could create martyrs and leave messy evidence. They began to perfect techniques aimed at inducing a state of psychological collapse. The Gestapo, for instance, mastered what they called verschärft Vernehmung, or intensified interrogation. This wasn't just one method, but a symphony of psychological pressures. It began with the arrest itself, the terrifying midnight knock on the door, being dragged from your home in front of your family. This initial shock was designed to disorient and terrify. Then came the isolation. Prisoners were held in solitary confinement, cut off from any human contact except for their interrogators. They would manipulate sleep, waking prisoners at random intervals, ensuring they could never achieve deep rest. The interrogations themselves were marathon sessions, lasting for days, where a team of officials would work in shifts, relentlessly questioning, accusing, and contradicting, until the prisoner's sense of time, reality, and self began to dissolve. They would use deception, telling a prisoner their family had been arrested or that their comrades had already confessed and implicated them. The goal was to create a state of debility, dependency, and dread. A person who is exhausted, isolated, and terrified becomes highly suggestible and desperate for the ordeal to end. They will not just confess. They will often come to believe their own confession. The Soviets, meanwhile, were pioneering a particularly insidious form of mental torture that blurred the lines between law enforcement and medicine. They developed the concept of sluggish schizophrenia, a fabricated diagnosis used to silence political dissenters. If a person persisted in believing in ideas contrary to the Communist Party line, like advocating for human rights or criticizing the government, they could be declared mentally ill. Their symptoms were listed as reformist delusions, poor adaptation to the social environment, and an obsessive-compulsive need to tell the truth. Think about that for a moment. The very act of dissent was pathologized, turned into a symptom of a mental disorder. These individuals weren't sent to the Gulag. They were sent to psychiatric hospitals where they were treated by state-employed doctors. Here, they were forcibly injected with powerful antipsychotic drugs that caused painful side effects, confusion, and a dulling of the intellect. They were locked away with genuinely and severely mentally ill patients, a disorienting and often terrifying experience. They were subjected to re-education sessions, a form of brainwashing designed to break their convictions. The cruelty was surgical. By labeling a dissident as insane, the state not only neutralized them but also discredited their ideas. Any message they tried to send to the outside world was dismissed as the ravings of a madman. It was a perfect, self-contained system of psychological annihilation, all under the guise of compassionate medical care. This was the terrifying perfection of mental warfare as a tool of state control, long before the Cold War officially began. The groundwork had been laid. The mind had been identified as a new and vulnerable frontier, and the world's major powers were about to engage in a silent, secret arms race to conquer it. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the world entered a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. This was not a war of open battles between superpowers, but a war of spies, proxies, and ideologies. It was a contest for hearts and minds, and in this shadowy arena, the science of psychological torture and manipulation would reach its chilling apex. Both East and West, locked in a paranoid struggle for dominance, poured vast resources into understanding and controlling the human mind. This period gave us some of the most infamous and ethically bankrupt research programs in history. On one side, you had the Soviet Union and its satellite states, which continued to refine the techniques they had developed in the preceding decades. The use of psychiatric abuse became even more systematic. But they also perfected the art of the show trial. The Moscow trials of the 1930s had been a grim dress rehearsal, but by the 1950s, the process was a well-oiled machine. High-ranking officials, war heroes, and intellectuals who had fallen out of favor with the state would be arrested and disappear for weeks or months. When they finally reappeared in a courtroom, they were hollowed-out versions of their former selves. They would stand before the world and calmly, methodically confess to the most absurd crimes. Being lifelong spies for Western powers, plotting to assassinate leaders, sabotaging the economy. The world watched, baffled. How could these proud, intelligent men be made to so thoroughly debase themselves? The answer lay in the unseen period between their arrest and their trial. It was a masterclass in psychological demolition. It involved a combination of the techniques we've already discussed: prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, endless interrogation, and the constant threat against their families. But it also involved a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation. The interrogators would often play the role of a patient, caring friend. They would tell the prisoner, "We know you are a good communist at heart. You have simply been led astray. The party needs you to perform one last service. By confessing to these fabricated crimes, you will help us expose the real enemies of the state. Your confession is your final act of loyalty." They were being asked to destroy themselves for the cause they had dedicated their lives to. After weeks of mental torment, exhausted and confused, many prisoners clung to this twisted logic as their only path to redemption. They were not just confessing. They were participating in their own psychological destruction as a final, desperate act of faith. On the other side of the curtain, the United States was growing increasingly paranoid. The sight of American POWs from the Korean War giving televised, seemingly sincere anti-American speeches terrified the intelligence community. They became obsessed with a new bogeyman: brainwashing. They believed the communists had discovered a secret key to unlock and reprogram the human mind, and they were desperate to find it themselves, not just to defend against it, but to use it. This fear gave birth to one of history's most notorious research programs, Project MKUltra. Run by the CIA from 1953 to 1973, MKUltra was a sprawling, top-secret, and often illegal endeavor to achieve the holy grail of mental warfare: mind control. Under the direction of a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, the program explored any and every conceivable method for breaking down the human ego and gaining control of a person's thoughts and actions. The list of sub-projects is a catalog of horrors. They experimented with hypnosis, subliminal messaging, and sensory deprivation. But their most famous and widespread area of research was in psychoactive drugs. The CIA became the largest institutional buyer of LSD in the world. They believed this powerful hallucinogen could be the key to shattering a person's reality, making them vulnerable to suggestion. And they tested it on unwitting American citizens. They dosed CIA employees, military personnel, mental patients, and prostitutes without their knowledge or consent, just to observe the effects. In one infamous operation called Midnight Climax, the CIA set up brothels in New York and San Francisco. They would dose the clients with LSD and then watch from behind two-way mirrors, taking notes on their behavior. The goal was to see if the drug could be used to make people reveal secrets or perform actions against their will. The human cost was immense. People were left with lifelong psychological trauma. Some, like the Army scientist Frank Olson, who was secretly dosed with LSD by his CIA colleagues, fell into a deep paranoia and depression, ultimately falling to his death from a hotel window a week later. A death his family has long maintained was murder. Project MKUltra was the dark heart of the West's foray into psychological warfare. It was driven by paranoia and a profound ethical void. But out of this chaos of unethical experimentation, the CIA began to codify what it was learning. The result was another infamous document, the QBARC Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, written in 1963. The QBARC Manual is a landmark text in the history of psychological torture. It's a remarkably sophisticated and chillingly detached guide to breaking a human being. The manual explicitly states that physical torture is often counterproductive. It produces unreliable information, strengthens the subject's will to resist, and is bad for public relations. The real path to a successful interrogation, QBARC argues, lies in psychological manipulation. The manual outlines a step-by-step process. First, it emphasizes the importance of controlling the environment. The subject should be arrested at a time of maximum disorientation, like midnight. They should be stripped of all personal possessions, their watch, their glasses, their wedding ring, anything that connects them to their identity. They should be held in a cell with no windows, where the interrogator controls the light, the temperature, and the food. Time itself becomes a weapon. By removing any way for the prisoner to track the passage of days, their internal clock is shattered, leading to profound disorientation. The manual then details a range of non-physical techniques. There is the silent treatment, where the interrogator simply sits in the room with the prisoner for hours, saying nothing, allowing the prisoner's own anxiety to become the torturer. There is the good cop/bad cop routine, called Mutt and Jeff, in the manual, designed to create psychological dependency on the good interrogator. There is the exploitation of personal phobias. The manual coldly advises interrogators to find out what the subject fears most, be it rats, spiders, or enclosed spaces, and then use that fear against them. But the core principle of QBARC is what it calls coercion. The goal is to cause the subject's psyche to regress. By stripping away their autonomy, their sense of time, their identity, and their connection to the outside world, you force them into an infantile state of dependency. In this state, the interrogator becomes the all-powerful parental figure who controls everything: pain and relief, fear and comfort. A subject in this state will not just give up information. They will become desperate to please their captor. It's a blueprint for the complete psychological subjugation of one human being by another. The theories and methods detailed in the QBARC manual would not remain on paper. They would soon be deployed in the field, most notably in the jungles and interrogation centers of the Vietnam War. Here, the Cold War turned hot, and the practice of mental warfare evolved from the interrogation room to the battlefield itself. The Vietnam War was a different kind of war. There were no clear front lines. The enemy was often indistinguishable from the civilian population. It was a war of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and victory, the U.S. military believed, depended on winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. But this benign-sounding phrase hid a much darker reality. The struggle for hearts and minds often involved a brutal and sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare. One of the most chilling examples of this was Operation Wandering Soul. This was a PSYOPs, psychological operations, campaign that drew on a deep understanding of Vietnamese culture and religious beliefs. Many Vietnamese people hold a traditional belief that the dead must be buried in their ancestral homeland to find peace in the afterlife. If a person dies a violent, lonely death far from home, their soul is believed to wander the earth as a tormented ghost, eternally suffering. The U.S. military decided to weaponize this belief. PSYOPs teams created what became known as ghost tapes. They recorded eerie, terrifying audio tracks featuring distorted human wails, funeral music, and ghostly voices calling out the names of Viet Cong soldiers, begging them to return home to their families before it was too late. The voices, often recorded by South Vietnamese collaborators, would whisper things like, "My friends, I am dead. I am in hell. It's a tragedy. Go home. Go home to your family or you will end up like me. Go home before it's too late." At night, U.S. soldiers would fly helicopters low over the jungle or sneak close to enemy positions and blast these recordings from powerful loudspeakers. Imagine being a young Viet Cong guerrilla, huddled in the dark, miles from your village, already on edge. Suddenly, the jungle around you comes alive with the wailing voices of the dead, the ghosts of your fallen comrades, calling out from the afterlife, promising you an eternity of torment if you continue to fight. The effect was profoundly unnerving. It was designed to prey on superstition, homesickness, and fear, to erode morale and encourage desertion. It was a perfect example of battlefield psychological torture, turning a people's most sacred beliefs into a weapon against them. But the mental warfare in Vietnam wasn't limited to the battlefield. It was also perfected in the prisons. For American POWs captured by the North Vietnamese, the experience was a living embodiment of the principles outlined in the QBARC manual. The most famous of these prisons was the Hoa Lo prison, grimly nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by its American inhabitants. Here, the goal was not necessarily to extract military intelligence, but to score propaganda victories. The North Vietnamese wanted to force American pilots to make public statements condemning the war and confessing to war crimes. To achieve this, they used a relentless combination of physical and psychological torture. But even the physical torture was often designed for a psychological effect. Prisoners were subjected to agonizing stress positions for days on end, a technique that leaves little physical evidence but causes excruciating pain and mental breakdown. But the core of the program was psychological. It was pure QBARC. New prisoners were immediately placed in extreme isolation to break their spirit and make them feel utterly alone. Their sense of time was destroyed. They were subjected to endless interrogation sessions, where they were told lies about the progress of the war, about their families at home, and about their fellow prisoners having already confessed. Humiliation was a key tool. They were paraded in front of hostile crowds, forced to bow, and filmed for propaganda reels. The ultimate goal was the forced confession. A prisoner would be tortured until he agreed to write a statement, then tortured further to rewrite it in the exact words the captors wanted. The process could take weeks, a slow, grinding destruction of a man's will. Yet, in the midst of this horror, the story of the Hanoi Hilton is also one of incredible psychological resilience. The prisoners developed a secret communication system called the tap code. By tapping on the walls, they could spell out words, share information, offer encouragement, and maintain a command structure. This simple act of communication was a powerful act of resistance. It broke the isolation that their captors worked so hard to enforce. It reminded them that they were not alone, that they were still part of a unit. They created a community in the heart of hell. The tap code was more than just a tool. It was a lifeline. It proved that while the techniques of psychological torture could be powerful, the human spirit's need for connection and meaning could, sometimes, be even more so. The battle for the mind in Vietnam was a two-way street, a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. As the 20th century drew to a close, it seemed as if the era of state-sponsored psychological torture might be fading. The Cold War was over. International conventions against torture had been signed. The dark secrets of programs like MKUltra had been exposed, leading to public outrage and official condemnation. But the seeds planted in the Cold War's soil had taken deep root. The knowledge, the manuals, and the mindset had not disappeared. They had simply gone dormant, waiting for a new conflict to reawaken them. That conflict arrived on September 11, 2001. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon plunged the United States into a new kind of conflict, the War on Terror. This was a war against a shadowy, non-state actor, a global network with no clear army or capital. In the face of this new threat, a wave of fear and anger swept the nation, and the old rules seemed, to some, to be obsolete. The pressure to get actionable intelligence to prevent future attacks was immense. In this climate of fear, the ghosts of QBARC and MKUltra were summoned back from the dead. The CIA and the U.S. military began capturing suspected Al-Qaeda members and transporting them to black sites, secret prisons around the world, far from the prying eyes of the media and the constraints of U.S. law. The most infamous of these locations was the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Here, a new lexicon for an old practice was born. It was no longer called torture. It was called enhanced interrogation techniques. This new name was a masterpiece of Orwellian doublespeak, designed to provide legal cover for practices that most would clearly define as torture. An examination of these techniques reveals a direct lineage from the psychological torture methods of the 20th century. In fact, many of them were lifted directly from the QBARC manual and from an unlikely source, the U.S. military's own SERE training program. SCRU, which stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escapeus, a program designed to train American soldiers on how to resist enemy interrogation if they are captured. It exposes them to a controlled version of the psychological and physical torments they might face, including stress positions, sleep deprivation, and isolation. In a profound and tragic irony, the very techniques used to train American soldiers to resist torture were reverse-engineered and used to inflict torture on detainees. Let's look at some of these enhanced techniques. There was sleep deprivation, sometimes lasting for over a week, a direct and proven method for inducing psychosis and breaking a person's will. There was the use of stress positions, like being forced to stand for hours with arms outstretched, a technique from the Hanoi Hilton designed to cause agony without leaving marks. There was dietary manipulation and the control of temperature, just as described in QBARC. There was the use of music as a weapon. Detainees were hooded and forced to listen to music, often heavy metal or even children's songs from shows like Barney and Friends, blasted at deafening volumes for days on end. This wasn't about entertainment. It was about sensory overload. The constant, inescapable noise prevents thought, shatters concentration, and becomes a form of auditory assault, a technique for psychological dislocation. And then there was waterboarding. While its proponents tried to classify it as a purely psychological technique, arguing it caused the fear of drowning without actual physical harm, it stands as the ultimate blurring of the line between mental and physical torture. The victim is strapped down, and water is poured over their cloth-covered face, stimulating the gag reflex and creating the terrifying, certain sensation that they are drowning. It is a controlled, near-death experience. The physical trauma may be minimal, but the psychological terror is absolute. It is the distilled essence of helplessness and dread, the ultimate goal of the QBARC philosophy. The revelations from Abu Ghraib, with its horrifying photos of hooded prisoners in stress positions and humiliated detainees, and the long, slow leak of information about the CIA's black sites, sparked a global firestorm of controversy. It forced a painful public debate about what lines a democratic society is willing to cross in the name of security. Proponents, including high-ranking government officials, argued that these methods were necessary and that they saved lives. They insisted they were not torture. Opponents, including many veteran interrogators, argued that not only were these techniques immoral and illegal, but they were also ineffective. Information extracted under duress is notoriously unreliable. A person being tortured will say anything to make the pain stop, including telling the interrogator what they think they want to hear. This debate brought the history we've been discussing full circle. The journey from the shell-shocked fields of France, through the psychiatric prisons of the USSR, the CIA's LSD labs, and the jungles of Vietnam, had led directly to the cells of Guantanamo Bay. It proved that the dark science of psychological torture was not a relic of a bygone era. It is a persistent and adaptable feature of modern warfare. It demonstrated how easily the knowledge of the mind's fragility can be weaponized, especially in times of great national fear. The 20th century didn't just invent new ways to kill. It perfected new ways to unmake a human being while leaving them technically alive. And the legacy of that knowledge continues to haunt us in the 21st. So, where does this long, dark journey leave us? We have walked through the mud of the trenches, sat in the sterile silence of the White Room, listened to the ghost tapes in the Vietnamese jungle, and stood in the shadows of Guantanamo Bay. We have seen how the 20th century transformed the art of cruelty from a brutish physical act into a precise and devastating science of the mind. The evolution of mental warfare is a chilling testament to human ingenuity applied to its darkest possible purpose. What we see is a clear and terrifying progression. It began with an observation, the discovery, through the tragedy of shell shock, that the mind has its own breaking points. This observation then became an objective, the systematic effort by totalitarian states and intelligence agencies to understand and exploit these breaking points. This led to a methodology, codified in secret manuals like QBARC, which provided a blueprint for dismantling a person's psyche through isolation, sensory manipulation, and the creation of absolute dependency. And finally, this methodology became policy, deployed in conflicts from the Cold War to the War on Terror, often disguised under sanitized new names like enhanced interrogation. The central, horrifying discovery of this entire century of dark research is this: you don't need a rack or a thumbscrew to destroy someone. All you need to do is take away the fundamental pillars of their sanity. Take away their sense of time. Take away their connection to others. Take away their control over their own body and environment. Take away their sleep. Take away silence. And in the void you create, the mind will begin to devour itself. This is the core principle of all modern psychological torture. But why does this history matter now? It matters because the consequences are not historical. They are with us today. The victims of these techniques, whether they are political dissidents from the 70s or detainees from the 2000s, carry the scars for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic depression, anxiety, and an inability to trust are the invisible wounds that never heal. This form of torture creates a permanent prison in the mind, one the victim can never truly escape. It also matters because the legal and ethical lines remain dangerously blurred. The debate over what constitutes torture continues to this day. By creating euphemisms like enhanced interrogation, governments create legal gray areas that allow these practices to continue just beyond the reach of international law. As long as this ambiguity exists, the door remains open for these techniques to be used again in future conflicts. And finally, it matters because this history reveals a fundamental truth about power. The impulse to control, to dominate, and to break the will of others is a constant in human affairs. The tools may change, from the branding iron to the sleep deprivation cell, but the desire remains. Understanding the history of psychological torture is a vital defense against its future use. It inoculates us against the seductive and dangerous argument that the ends justify the means. It forces us to confront the reality that when we embrace these methods, we risk becoming the very thing we claim to be fighting against. The story of the 20th century's war on the mind is ultimately a story of a battle between fragility and resilience. It showcases the terrifying fragility of the human psyche when subjected to systematic, scientific assault. But in the stories of resistance, seen the tap code of the Hanoi Hilton, in the stubborn defiance of dissidents who refuse to break, we also see the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The need for dignity, for connection, and for meaning is a powerful force. But it is not invincible. The history of modern wars teaches us that while the human spirit can endure almost anything, it should never be asked to. The silent battlefields of the mind are the most tragic of all, for their victories are measured in broken souls, and their cost is a piece of our collective humanity. If you found this exploration into the darker side of modern history compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. We believe that understanding these difficult subjects is crucial to understanding the world we live in today. And we want to hear from you. What aspect of this history of psychological torture was the most surprising or disturbing to you? Was it the medicalization of dissent in the Soviet Union, the CIA's reckless experiments in Project MKUltra, or the reemergence of these techniques in the 21st century? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these important, often overlooked stories to light. Thank you for listening.